In 1429, a teenage peasant girl walked into a war council and told seasoned commanders they'd been fighting wrong. Within 9 days, she'd prove it, smashing through English fortifications that had held for 7 months. This is how 4,000 soldiers broke a siege everyone said was already lost. But here's what makes this story impossible. She couldn't read, she couldn't write, she'd never held a sword before that year. And she was about to humiliate the most feared army in Europe, April 1429. France is dying, not slowly, not gracefully. France is bleeding out on a battlefield that stretches from Normandy to the Loire, and the English are holding the knife. For nearly a century, 2 kingdoms have been tearing each other apart. The 100 Years' War, a name that doesn't capture the horror. Generations have been born, lived, and died knowing nothing but this conflict. Villages burned, families scattered, and now, after decades of grinding warfare, England is winning. Not just winning, dominating. The English have Paris, they have Normandy, they have Aquitaine, and their armies, hardened, professional, terrifying, are pushing south with a momentum that feels unstoppable. But there's one city standing in their way: Orléans. You need to understand what Orléans meant in 1429. This wasn't just another town. This wasn't just another siege. Orléans was the lock on the Loire River, the last major barrier between English-controlled territory and the heartland of what remained of France. Picture a map. The English control everything north of the Loire. The Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned French king, hiding in his castles, doubted by his own court, controls a shrinking pocket to the south. And Orléans? Orléans sits right on the river, right on the border, right on the edge of everything. If Orléans falls, the English push south. If Orléans falls, the Loire is breached. If Orléans falls, there is no more France. The city knows this. The Dauphin knows this. The Danbury English definitely know this, and that's why they've built something monstrous. The English don't attack Orléans the way you might expect. They don't throw armies against its walls. They don't try to storm the gates. No, they're smarter than that, more patient, more terrifying. They build a network. Imagine a noose made of fortresses. The English construct a ring of bastilles, small fortified positions, around Orléans. Not one wall, but many walls. Not one siege tower, but a constellation of strong points that choke every road, every river crossing, every supply line. To the east, Fort Saint-Loup watching the road to Burgundy. To the west, more bastilles blocking escape toward Blois. To the south, the crucial position: Les Tourelles, a fortified bridge complex that controls the only crossing over the Loire, and supporting it, Les Augustins, a converted monastery turned into a killing ground. The English don't need to break down Orléans' walls. They just need to wait. Starve the city. Strangle it. Watch it wither. And it's working. By early 1429, Orléans is dying slowly. Food is running low. Morale is collapsing. The citizens watch the English fortifications grow stronger every week, and they know that no one is coming to save them. The Dauphin sends occasional relief forces. They fail. They retreat. They accomplish nothing. The English commanders drink wine in their bastilles and wait. Time is on their side. Every day the noose tightens. Every day Orléans weakens. But here's the problem the English don't see coming. They've built an impressive network, a strangling ring of fortifications. But they've made a critical mistake. They don't have enough men. Think about it. The English are trying to surround an entire city. They're maintaining what? A dozen separate fortified positions? More. Each one needs a garrison. Each one needs supplies. Each one needs to hold against potential French attacks. And the English army isn't infinite. It's professional, yes. Deadly, yes. But it's stretched, thin. Every bastille they build dilutes their strength a little more. The siege network looks impregnable from outside. But inside, the commanders know the truth. They're gambling. They're betting that France is too broken, too demoralized, too divided to mount a real counterattack. For 7 months, that bet pays off. And then everything changes. Because in February 1429, something inexplicable happens in the village of Vaucouleurs. A 17-year-old peasant girl named Jeanne, we call her Joan, walks into the local garrison and demands an audience with the commander. She tells him she's been sent by God. She tells him she will save Orléans. She tells him she will crown the Dauphin as the true king of France. The commander laughs at her, sends her away. She comes back. He sends her away again. She comes back again. And here's the thing that defies explanation. Eventually, he listens. Eventually, he gives her an escort to the Dauphin's court. Eventually, he decides that maybe, this impossible girl is worth a chance. Why? Historians have debated this for 6 centuries. Was it her conviction? Her strange charisma? The desperation of a losing war that made even miracles seem worth trying? We don't know. We can't know. But what we do know is this. In March 1429, Joan of Arc arrives at the court of the Dauphin Charles. She identifies him in a crowd, even though he's disguised. She convinces his theologians she's not a witch, not a heretic, not a fraud. She asks for armor, a horse, and an army. And against all reason, against all logic, against everything that should happen in a medieval court full of scheming nobles and suspicious clerics, she gets them. Now the clock is ticking. It's April 1429, and Orléans is running out of time. But something strange is happening outside the walls, something the starving citizens don't know about yet. The siege is cracking. See, the English haven't been fighting alone. They've had a crucial ally, the Duchy of Burgundy. The Burgundians are French, technically, but they've sided with England in this war. Their soldiers have been helping maintain the siege. Their resources have been propping up the whole operation. And in April 1429, Burgundy pulls out. Why? Politics. The Duke of Burgundy has his own agenda, his own calculations, his own games. Maybe he sees the siege dragging on too long. Maybe he's hedging his bets. Maybe he just doesn't want to be there when things go wrong. Whatever the reason, the Burgundian forces withdraw. And suddenly, the English siege network, already stretched thin, gets thinner. The English commanders aren't stupid. They see what's happening. They request reinforcements from England. They try to redistribute their forces. They do everything they can to maintain the noose around Orléans. But the cracks are showing. Meanwhile, inside the city, the people are losing hope. They don't know about the Burgundian withdrawal. They don't know the siege is weaker than it looks. All they know is that they're hungry, they're scared, and every relief attempt has failed. The garrison commanders argue about what to do. Some want to negotiate, some want to hold out, some want to attempt a breakout. And far away, in the Dauphin's court, a different argument is raging. What do we do with the girl? The Dauphin's court is a snake pit. You need to understand this. Charles VII, though he won't officially be the 7th until he's crowned, is not ruling from a position of strength. He's hiding, retreating, watching his kingdom shrink while his nobles scheme against each other and his treasury bleeds dry. And now his advisors are screaming at each other about a peasant girl who claims God sent her to save France. Some think she's a miracle. Some think she's a fraud. Some think she's a witch who will damn them all. And some, the pragmatists, the cynics, the men who've watched every hope die for years, think it simply doesn't matter. France is finished either way. Why not let the girl try? It's a brutal calculus. If Joan fails, they've lost nothing they weren't already losing. If Joan succeeds, well, that would be a miracle, and France desperately needs a miracle. So they make the decision. Give her the army. Send her to Orléans. Let God sort it out. But here's the thing the court doesn't fully grasp. They're not just sending a symbol. They're not just dispatching a mascot to boost morale. They're about to unleash something they don't understand. Because Joan of Arc doesn't think like they do. The French commanders have been fighting this war for decades. They've learned caution. They've learned patience. They've learned that the English longbow turns charging knights into pincushions, that English defensive positions are meat grinders, that aggressive tactics get you killed. They've learned to be afraid. Joan hasn't learned any of that. She's 17. She's never seen an English army cut down a French charge. She's never watched friends die on sharpened stakes. She's never felt the paralyzing terror of facing the best infantry in Europe. All she knows is that God told her to save Orléans, and she's going to do it. Now, fast, without hesitation. This is either insanity or genius. In April 1429, no one knows which. April 29th, 1429, the date that changes everything. Joan of Arc approaches Orléans with roughly 4,000 soldiers and a supply convoy that the city desperately needs. 4,000 men. That's it. That's what France has scraped together to break a siege that's held for 7 months. 4,000 against the English Empire. But here's the first miracle. They get in. The English siege network has gaps. The Burgundian withdrawal has created weaknesses, and the French commanders, working with Joan, sometimes arguing with her, find a way through. They slip past the Bastilles. They cross the river. They enter Orléans, and when Joan rides through the gates, the city explodes, not with violence, with hope. You have to understand what this moment meant to the people of Orléans. For 7 months, they've been dying. For 7 months, they've watched the English noose tighten. For 7 months, they've prayed for salvation that never came. And now here she is. The maid, the girl they've heard rumors about, the one who says God sent her. She's real. She's here. She's brought soldiers and food and something even more valuable. She's brought belief. The citizens mob her. They reach out to touch her armor, her horse, her banner. Torches wave in the darkness. Voices cry out her name. The church bells ring and ring and ring. Joan of Arc has entered Orléans, and nothing will ever be the same. But the English are still out there. Dawn breaks on April 30th, and the reality sets in. The siege isn't broken. The Bastilles still stand. The English still control the roads, the river crossings, the supply lines. Joan's arrival has bought time, bought hope, bought morale. It hasn't bought victory, not yet. And now the arguments begin. Joan wants to attack, immediately, now, today. The French commanders, experienced soldiers, veterans of this brutal war, want to wait. They want to plan. They want to gather more troops, assess the English positions, find the perfect moment. They've seen what happens when you rush against English fortifications. They've buried the men who tried. But Joan doesn't care. You have been in your council, she tells them, and I have been in mine, and know that the counsel of God will be accomplished and will succeed, and that your counsel will perish. This is not how you talk to medieval military commanders. This is not how a teenage peasant addresses seasoned nobles and knights. This is not how anything works. But Joan does it anyway. And the strangest thing? It starts working. Not because the commanders suddenly believe in her visions, not because they think God is actually speaking through her, but because, for the first time in years, someone is proposing a different strategy. Not defense, attack, not patience, speed, not caution, aggression. The French have been fighting the English way for decades, slowly, carefully, reactively, and they've been losing. Maybe it's time to try something else. Maybe it's time to fight like they have nothing left to lose, because they don't. The next few days are chaos. Joan pushes for immediate assault. The commanders push back. Messages fly between the French camp and the English Bastilles. Insults, threats, demands for surrender. Joan sends letters to the English commanders telling them to leave France or face destruction. The English laugh. They call her names we won't repeat here. They promise to burn her as a witch when they catch her. They're not laughing for long, because while the arguments rage, something is shifting inside the French army. The soldiers have seen Joan. They've heard her voice. They've watched her ride along the lines, fearless, burning with certainty. And they're starting to believe. Not in her visions, necessarily. Not in her divine mission, but in something simpler, something more primal. They're starting to believe they can win. For years, the English have seemed invincible. Agincourt, Verneuil, battle after battle where French courage shattered against English discipline. The soldiers know the stories. The soldiers have lived the stories. But this girl doesn't seem to know she's supposed to be afraid. And that fearlessness? It's contagious. The French army that entered Orléans on April 29th is not the same army that wakes up on May 4th. Something has changed. Something has hardened. The men are restless, eager, angry. They want to fight. And Joan is about to give them their chance. May 4th, 1429. The waiting ends. Fort Saint-Loup sits east of Orléans, watching the road that leads toward Burgundian territory. It's not the strongest English position. It's not the most important. But it's isolated, exposed. And the French have noticed. The attack isn't even supposed to happen today. Joan is resting. She's been driving herself relentlessly since her arrival, and even she needs sleep. The commanders are still debating. The plan is still forming. But the army is done waiting. A French sortie pushes out toward Saint-Loup. Skirmishing begins, and suddenly, without orders, without authorization, the thing grows. More soldiers pour out of Orléans. The skirmish becomes a battle. The battle becomes an assault. Joan wakes up to the sound of fighting. What happens next becomes legend. She calls for her armor. Her squire fumbles. He's not ready. Nothing is ready. And Joan doesn't care. She's strapping on plates while running for her horse. Someone hands her the banner she carries everywhere. White, painted with lilies, and the image of Christ. And then she's gone. Racing toward the sound of battle. Racing toward her destiny. When Joan reaches Saint-Loup, the assault is already faltering. The English garrison is fighting hard, and the French, despite their numbers, haven't broken through. Then the soldiers see her banner. It's hard to describe what happens next. The chronicles try. They talk about a surge of energy, a renewed fury, a sudden impossible momentum. The French throw themselves at the English fortifications with something beyond courage, something like faith. Within hours, Fort Saint-Loup falls. The English garrison is destroyed, over 100 dead. The survivors are captured or scattered. The Bastille that has watched Orléans for months is burning. And the French? They barely believe it themselves. They've done it. They've actually done it. They've stormed an English fortification and won. After years of defeat, after years of humiliation, after years of watching their knights die against English walls, they've won. It's proof of concept. It's validation. It's the first crack in the English siege, the first stone pulled from the wall. But Joan isn't celebrating. She's already looking south, toward the river, toward the fortifications that really matter, because Saint-Loup was just the beginning. The keystone of the English siege, Les Tourelles, the fortified bridge, is still standing, and until it falls, Orléans isn't free. The assault must continue. The tempo must accelerate. The English must not be given time to recover, regroup, reinforce. Tomorrow isn't good enough. Tomorrow might be too late. But May 5 is Ascension Day. Holy Day. Even Joan won't fight on Ascension Day. So the army rests, prays, prepares, and waits for May 6th, 1429. The sun rises over Orléans, and the French army is already moving. But here's where Joan's commanders do something clever. something that proves this isn't just about divine inspiration and reckless courage. There's actual strategy happening. They're not going to attack Les Tourelles directly. Not yet. That would be suicide. Look at the English position on the south bank. Les Tourelles, the fortified bridge complex, is the keystone. It's the strongest point. It controls the river crossing. It's bristling with English soldiers who know that if they hold this position, the siege survives. But Les Tourelles doesn't stand alone. To support it, the English have fortified Les Augustins, an old Augustinian monastery converted into a military strongpoint. It sits just south of the bridge complex, protecting Les Tourelles' flank. Any French attack on the bridge has to deal with Les Augustins first. The French commanders understand this, and so does Joan. The plan? Cross the river, take Les Augustins, isolate Les Tourelles, cut the keystone off from any support, then strike. It's logical, it's methodical, it's exactly the kind of sequential tactical thinking that wins sieges. But here's the problem. It requires crossing the Loire. The Loire in May is not a gentle river. It's wide, it's fast. And the English are watching. Any crossing will be observed, any landing will be contested. The French will be vulnerable, caught between water and walls, with enemies on both sides. They do it anyway. Using boats, using a makeshift bridge of their own, the French army crosses to the south bank. Not all of them. There are still English bastilles on the north side that need watching. But enough. Enough to attack. Enough to overwhelm. And when they land? The English know they're coming. Of course they know. You can't move an army across a major river without being noticed. The garrison at Les Augustins is ready. The garrison at Les Tourelles is ready. Every English soldier on the south bank knows that the French are about to try something desperate. They're confident. Why wouldn't they be? They've been beating the French for years. They have fortifications. They have discipline. They have the longbow, the weapon that turns French charges into massacres. They've seen this story before. They know how it ends. Except this time, they're wrong. The assault on Les Augustins is brutal. There's no other word for it. The French throw themselves at the monastery walls with a fury that shocks the defenders. Arrows rain down. Men fall screaming. The ditches fill with bodies. But the French keep coming. And here's where Joan's presence matters in ways that go beyond symbolism. She's there, in the front lines, visible to everyone, her banner snapping in the wind, white against the smoke and blood. When soldiers falter, they see her. When courage wavers, they hear her voice. When the assault seems doomed, when rational men would retreat and regroup, she pushes forward. And they follow. Not because they think she's invincible, not because they think God will protect them, but because she's doing the impossible thing right in front of them, and somehow that makes it possible. The psychology of combat is strange. Men can endure unimaginable horrors if they believe, if they truly believe, that it means something. Joan gives them that meaning. Joan gives them permission to be braver than they are. And so they take Les Augustins. The English garrison fights hard. They always fight hard. But they're overwhelmed. The monastery falls. The French pour in, killing, capturing, claiming. Another English strongpoint gone. Another piece of the siege shattered. But night is falling. And Les Tourelles, the keystone, the prize, the whole point, is still standing. Still bristling with English defenders. Still controlling the bridge. The French commanders want to stop, consolidate, rest the troops, attack again tomorrow. Joan argues otherwise. She wants to press on. Right now, while the English are reeling, while the momentum is still French. If they wait, the English will recover. If they wait, reinforcements might arrive. If they wait... But she's overruled. The commanders insist. The men are exhausted. The attack will continue tomorrow. Joan relents. Barely. That night, she sends a message to the English garrison at Les Tourelles. Surrender. Leave. This is your last chance. They shoot the messenger. Fine. Tomorrow then, May 7th, 1429. This is the day. This is the moment everything has been building toward. This is when the siege of Orléans lives or dies. Dawn breaks, and the French are already forming up. Thousands of soldiers assembled on the south bank, staring at the fortified bridge complex that has blocked their city for months. Les Tourelles is a nightmare. The English have had 7 months to prepare this position. They've fortified everything. Walls, towers, barricades. The bridge approach is a killing ground, designed to funnel attackers into overlapping fields of fire. The garrison inside is experienced, disciplined, desperate. They know that if Les Tourelles falls, the siege is over. They know that if Les Tourelles falls, they're probably dead. They're going to fight like it. The French attack begins in the morning. It goes badly, wave after wave. Hurls itself at the English walls. Wave after wave is thrown back. The ditches around Les Tourelles fill with French dead. Arrows and crossbow bolts cut down men by the dozen. The English are holding. Hours pass. The sun climbs. The assault continues. And then it happens. Around midday, Joan is in the thick of it. Where else would she be? When a crossbow bolt catches her. The bolt hits her shoulder just above the breastplate. It punches through cloth and flesh and lodges deep. Joan goes down. Silence. For a heartbeat, everything stops. The French soldiers see their champion fall. The English see it too. They cheer, they howl, they think the attack is broken. Joan is carried away from the walls. And here's where the story should end, right? The girl is wounded. The assault has failed. The English have held. The siege continues. That's the logical outcome. That's what should happen. But Joan of Arc doesn't know the word should. They pull the bolt out. We don't know exactly how. Some accounts say she did it herself. Some say others helped. All agree on one thing. It hurt. Medieval battlefield surgery was not gentle, and crossbow bolts are designed to stay in. She bleeds. She prays. She weeps, not from fear, the witnesses say, but from pain and frustration. The battle is raging without her. The assault is faltering without her, and she's lying in a tent, wounded, while everything falls apart. Doctors want to apply charms and poultices. Folk medicine, half pagan, half desperate. Joan refuses. She'll trust in God, not superstition. Bandages. Prayer, that's all. Time passes. Too much time. The assault continues without her, but the momentum is gone. The soldiers have seen Joan fall. They think she might be dead. The fury that drove them through Les Augustins is bleeding away with every failed charge. The French commanders begin discussing retreat. It's late afternoon. The men are exhausted. They've been attacking for hours without success. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe with fresh troops. Maybe. And then Joan reappears. She walks out of the tent. She calls for her horse. She takes up her banner, that white banner now stained with her blood, and she rides back toward the walls of Les Tourelles. The soldiers see her coming. She's alive. She's standing. She's heading back into the fight. And something breaks, not in the French army, in the English. The final assault is almost supernatural. There's no other word that fits. The French, exhausted and bloodied, find something beyond their reserves. They hit Les Tourelles with everything they have left. Ladders go up. Men climb. The fighting is hand to hand, face to face, blade against blade. Joan plants her banner at the edge of the ditch and refuses to move. "Watch," she tells the soldiers around her. "When my banner touches the wall, the fortress is ours." It sounds insane. It sounds like the ravings of a fevered, wounded girl who's lost too much blood. But the soldiers are beyond logic now. They're beyond fear. They're beyond anything rational. They believe her. The banner moves forward. Men follow. The French surge up the walls. The English, outnumbered, exhausted, shaken by the inexplicable resilience of their enemies, begin to crack. And then Les Tourelles falls. The English commander, Sir William Glasdale, the man who mocked Joan, who called her a witch, who promised to burn her, dies in the collapse. The drawbridge breaks. Glasdale plunges into the Loire in full armor. He drowns. The English garrison shatters. Some die fighting. Some drown trying to escape. Some surrender. It doesn't matter. The keystone has broken. Les Tourelles belongs to France. The bridge to Orléans is open. The siege is over. May 8th, 1429. The morning after the impossible. When the sun rises over Orléans, the citizens climb to their walls and rooftops to see something they never thought they'd witness. Something that seemed like a fantasy just 9 days ago. The English are leaving, not retreating, in panic, not fleeing in chaos. The English army is too professional for that, too disciplined, too proud. They form up outside the city walls in battle order, ranks dressed, banners flying, weapons ready. They're offering battle. It's a challenge, a dare. One last chance to settle this the old way, army against army, in the open field where English longbows have shattered French charges for generations. The French commanders look at that formation and see the trap. They've won. They've actually won. Why risk everything on a field battle against the most dangerous infantry in Europe? Joan wants to fight. Of course she does. When has Joan ever wanted anything else? The English are right there. The enemy is in the open. Attack. Finish this. Drive them into the ground. But she won't do it. Not today. May 8th, 1429, is a Sunday. The Lord's Day. And Joan of Arc, this girl who has thrown herself against fortified walls, who has taken a crossbow bolt to the shoulder and walked back into battle, who has defied every rule of medieval warfare, will not fight on Sunday. It's a strange moment. A pause in the fury. The French army forms up opposite the English, and for hours the two forces simply watch each other. No attacks, no charges, no arrows, just waiting. And then finally the English turn and march away. They leave behind their dead. They leave behind their wounded. They leave behind the shattered remains of a siege that was supposed to strangle France forever. 7 months of work, destroyed in 9 days. The English column moves north, toward their remaining strongholds, toward Paris, toward whatever comes next. They're not broken. The English army will fight again, will win battles again, will remain dangerous for decades. But something has changed. Something fundamental has shifted in this war. The English seemed invincible. They seemed unstoppable. They seemed like the inevitable winners of a conflict that had dragged on for nearly a century. Now, they're marching away from a city they couldn't take. Beaten by an army they should have crushed. Defeated by a strategy that shouldn't have worked. Defeated by a girl who shouldn't exist. Inside Orléans, the celebration begins. And it doesn't stop. The bells ring all day. Not the desperate, fearful bells of a city under siege, the joyous, triumphant bells of liberation. People flood the streets, they weep, they embrace strangers, they fall to their knees in prayer. For 7 months they've been dying. For 7 months they've watched their food supplies dwindle, their hope fade, their future disappear. Now they're free, and in the middle of it all, there's Joan. She's exhausted. She's wounded. Her shoulder still bandaged, still aching. She's been running on faith and fury for over a week, and the human cost of that is written on her face. But she's smiling. The citizens surround her. They touch her armor, her horse, her hands. They call her the Maid of Orléans, a title that will follow her through history. They look at her like she's something more than human. Maybe she is. Maybe she isn't. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that Orléans is free. What matters is that the English are gone. What matters is that the impossible has happened, and everyone saw it, and no one can pretend otherwise. France has a future again, and Joan of Arc isn't finished. But we need to pause here. We need to step back from the celebration, the ringing bells, the weeping citizens. We need to understand what actually happened, because the siege of Orléans wasn't broken by a miracle. It wasn't broken by divine intervention. It wasn't broken by supernatural forces descending from heaven to smite the English. It was broken by strategy, by speed, by aggression, by a fundamental shift in how the French army fought. And Joan was at the center of all of it. Not as a general. She wasn't commanding troops in any traditional sense. The actual tactical decisions, where to, cross the river, which fortifications to target first, how to coordinate the assaults, came from experienced commanders like Jean de Dunois, La Hire, and others. Joan didn't replace these men. She catalyzed them. For years, the French had been fighting scared. They'd learned from bitter experience that attacking English positions meant death. They'd learned caution. They'd learned patience. They'd learned to wait for perfect conditions that never came. Joan broke that pattern. She didn't know she was supposed to be afraid. She didn't carry the psychological weight of decades of defeat. She looked at the English fortifications and saw obstacles to overcome, not death sentences to avoid. And her confidence, reckless, irrational, absolutely unshakable, infected everyone around her. The commanders found themselves approving attacks they would have rejected a month earlier. The soldiers found themselves charging walls they would have retreated from a week before. The whole French army discovered a capacity for aggression it had forgotten it possessed. That's what Joan brought to Orléans. Not magic, something more powerful. Belief. So what actually broke the siege of Orléans? It's easy to tell this story as a fairy tale. The peasant girl, the divine mission, the miraculous victory. It makes for great drama. It's been making great drama for 600 years. But history is messier than fairy tales, and the truth is more interesting. The siege was always vulnerable. Remember what we said at the beginning? The English had built an impressive network of fortifications, but they didn't have enough men to garrison all of them properly. They were stretched thin. Too many bastilles, too few soldiers, too much ground to cover. When Burgundy withdrew their support in April, that vulnerability became critical. The siege network that looked impregnable from outside was actually fragile. It was a shell waiting to be cracked. Joan's army provided the hammer. But it wasn't just about numbers. The French had sent relief forces before. They'd all failed. What made this time different? Speed. Look at the timeline. Joan enters Orléans on April 29th. Fort Saint-Loup falls on May 4th. Les Augustins falls on May 6th. Les Tourelles falls on May 7th. The English withdraw on May 8th. 9 days. That's it. 9 days to break a siege that had held for 7 months. The French didn't give the English time to react. They didn't give them time to reinforce. They didn't give them time to shift troops from one bastille to another. Each assault came before the English could recover from the last one. It was relentless. It was exhausting. It was brilliant. And it was completely different from how the French had been fighting. There's a military concept called tempo. It refers to the speed of operations, how quickly an army can make decisions, execute plans, and adapt to changing circumstances. In the years before Orléans, the English controlled the tempo of the 100 Years' War. They chose when and where to fight. They built their fortifications and waited for the French to break themselves against English walls. They were patient, methodical, devastating. At Orléans, Joan seized the tempo. She didn't wait for perfect conditions. She didn't carefully plan every assault. She attacked and attacked and attacked again. The English found themselves reacting instead of dictating. They found themselves defending instead of controlling. And they couldn't keep up. Every bastille that fell weakened the others. Every French victory created opportunities for more victories. The siege network that required every position to support every other position started collapsing like dominoes. Saint-Lô fell, and suddenly the eastern approach was open. Les Augustins fell, and suddenly Les Tourelles was isolated. Les Tourelles fell, and suddenly the whole siege was pointless. Speed, aggression, sequential attacks that never let the enemy stabilize. That's what won it, Orléans. But let's not diminish what Joan did. Because here's the thing about military strategy. It doesn't matter if no one executes it. You can have the perfect plan. You can see exactly what needs to happen. But if your soldiers won't fight, if your commanders won't risk, if your army has forgotten how to win, your plan is worthless. The French knew the English siege was vulnerable. They'd known for months. The commanders weren't stupid. They could see the gaps, the weaknesses, the stretched thin garrisons. But they couldn't act. Because acting meant attacking meant risking, and risking meant facing the terror of English arrows, English walls, English discipline. The psychological weight of decades of defeat had paralyzed them. Joan broke that paralysis, not with tactics, not with strategy, with something simpler and far more powerful. She made them believe they could win. Think about what that means. Think about what it takes to convince an army, an entire army, thousands of men who have watched their brothers die in failed assaults, that this time will be different. You can't do it with speeches. You can't do it with promises. You can only do it by showing them. And Joan showed them. She was first into danger, first toward the walls, first to take a wound, and first to return to battle. She didn't ask her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do herself. No, that's not strong enough. She did things they would never ask of themselves. And she did them with such absolute conviction, such unshakable faith, that it became contagious. The men who followed Joan to Orléans weren't braver than the men who had failed before. They weren't stronger. They weren't better trained. They were inspired. And that made all the difference. We need to talk about the commanders. Because Joan didn't do this alone. The fairy tale version of this story puts her at the center of everything. The lone hero who saved France through sheer willpower and divine favor. The truth is more complex. And honestly, more impressive. Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, illegitimate son of the Duke, was the real military commander of the defense. He'd been holding the city together for months before Joan arrived. He planned the assaults, coordinated the troops, managed the logistics. La Hire, the famous French captain, legendary for his ferocity, led men into the worst of the fighting. When walls needed storming, La Hire was there. When charges needed leading, La Hire was at the front. Gilles de Rais, yes, that Gilles de Rais, before his descent into the horrors that would make him infamous, commanded troops and fought alongside the others. These were experienced soldiers, hardened veterans, men who knew war in ways Joan never could. And they listened to her. Not always, not without argument. The chronicles are full of their conflicts, Joan pushing for attack, the commanders urging caution, tensions flaring in war councils, but in the end, they followed her lead. They let her set the tempo. They attacked when she said attack, charged when she said charge, risked everything when she said this was the moment. Why? Maybe they believed in her visions. Maybe they were desperate enough to try anything. Maybe they saw something in her, some quality of leadership they couldn't name, that transcended her youth, her gender, her inexperience. We'll never know for certain, but we know the result. Joan provided the spark. The commanders provided the fuel. Together they created a fire that the English couldn't extinguish. Here's what the English never understood. They thought they were fighting an army. They were fighting an idea. The idea was simple. France can win. For years, that idea had seemed like fantasy. The English victories, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, loomed over every battlefield like ghosts. French knights had charged English lines again and again, and again and again they'd been slaughtered. The lesson seemed clear. England was destined to rule France. Resistance was futile. The smart move was surrender, accommodation, acceptance of English dominion. Joan made that lesson obsolete. Not by defeating the entire English army, not by winning the whole war in one battle, just by proving, once, definitively, undeniably, that the English could be beaten. Fort Saint-Loup fell. English soldiers died. A French assault succeeded. It sounds small. It wasn't. Because once you've proven something is possible, you can never unprove it. Once you've shown that walls can be stormed, garrisons can be defeated, sieges can be broken, that knowledge doesn't go away. The men who fought at Orléans carried that knowledge with them for the rest of the war. The men who heard about Orléans in towns across France, in armies that hadn't yet formed, absorbed that knowledge into their bones. England can be beaten. We proved it at Orléans. That's what Joan gave France, not just a military victory, a psychological revolution. The siege of Orléans ended on May 8, 1429. Joan didn't rest. Within weeks, she was campaigning again. The French army, energized, confident, transformed, swept through the Loire Valley. English strongholds that had held for years fell in days. Jargeau, Meung, Beaugency, Patay, especially Patay. On June 18, 1429, barely 6 weeks after Orléans, the French caught an English army in the open and destroyed it. Not defeated, destroyed. The English longbowmen, those legendary killers who had massacred French knights for a century, were overrun before they could form their lines. It was Agincourt in reverse. And it happened because the French had learned something at Orléans. Don't give the English time to prepare. Don't let them set up their stakes and their archers. Hit them fast. Hit them hard. Never stop hitting them. Speed and aggression beat patience and fortification. Joan had taught them that. And they'd learned. On July 17, 1429, the Dauphin Charles was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner. Think about that. 3 months earlier, Charles was a fugitive pretender, hiding in his castles, doubted by half his court, dismissed by his enemies. Now he was anointed king, crowned in the traditional cathedral, legitimate in the eyes of God and France. Joan had promised this would happen. Back in Vaucouleurs, back when she was just a peasant girl demanding an audience, she had promised to crown the Dauphin. And she had done it. The impossible girl had kept her impossible promise. But fairy tales have to end. Joan's story didn't stop at the coronation. She kept fighting, kept pushing, kept believing that God's mission required her to drive the English from every corner of France. But the momentum was fading. The king was cautious. The court was scheming. The commanders who had followed her at Orléans were less willing to take risks now that they had something to lose. On May 23, 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces at Compiègne. She was sold to the English. She was tried for heresy by a corrupt ecclesiastical court. She was condemned. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen. She was 19 years old. The English thought killing her would end the idea she represented. They were wrong. France won the 100 Years' War. Not immediately. The conflict dragged on for decades after Joan's death. But the tide had turned at Orléans, and it never turned back. By 1453, the English had been driven from nearly all of France, and Joan? In 1456, a posthumous trial declared her innocent. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. The peasant girl who broke the siege became a symbol of France itself. Her image adorns paintings, statues, churches. Her name is invoked whenever the French need to remember who they are and what they can accomplish. Not bad for a teenager who couldn't read. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's about strategy, about speed, and aggression, and never letting your enemy stabilize. About attacking weak points and maintaining tempo, and understanding that fortifications are only as strong as the men defending them. Maybe it's about psychology, about how belief can transform an army, about how one person's unshakable conviction can spread like fire through demoralized troops, about the strange alchemy that turns defeat into victory. Maybe it's about something simpler. Sometimes the impossible happens, not because the universe is fair, not because good always triumphs, not because God personally intervenes in human affairs, but because sometimes, rarely, improbably, against all evidence and expectation, someone comes along who doesn't know they're supposed to fail, and they succeed anyway. In 1429, a teenage peasant girl walked into a war council and told seasoned commanders they'd been fighting wrong. Within 9 days, she'd proved it. And nothing was ever the same.